It was the kind of flight where every detail was polished to perfection. The soft hum of the engines, the pristine luxury of first class, the attendants moving gracefully down the aisle. Clint Eastwood, as always, was a man of few words, choosing, instead, to observe the world around him with the quiet wisdom that had come with age. As he settled into his seat, the flight attendant approached, her smile warm and professional. She greeted him with a courteous nod. But there was a certain air of superiority about her that Clint didn't quite catch at first. The flight had just taken off and everything seemed normal, until the attendant returned to check on the passengers. She walked up to Clint's seat, glancing down at his attire with a hint of disdain. Clint, who had always favored simplicity, was dressed in a modest jacket and slacks, nothing extravagant or ostentatious. The flight attendant, however, seemed to have a different idea of what was appropriate for first class. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm afraid you're not allowed to wear that in this section. You'll have to change into something more suitable." Clint looked up at her, his face calm, but his eyes betrayed a hint of surprise. "I'm sorry?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You heard me," she said, her voice firm. "You can't be in first class wearing that." The words hung in the air. But Clint didn't react immediately. Instead, he simply took a deep breath, his mind already processing the situation. The attendant's words weren't just about his attire. They were about something deeper, an assumption, a judgment, about who he was, and Clint had had enough of those in his life. The attendant stood there, waiting for Clint to respond, her arms crossed and her gaze unwavering. She seemed to think that her position of authority would force him into compliance. But Clint, in his calm manner, simply looked up at her, his eyes locked onto hers with a quiet intensity that seemed to make the air around them grow still. A few moments passed before Clint finally spoke, his voice calm, but with a steady undertone that conveyed a message beyond his words. "I've been traveling for decades," he said, his tone just above a whisper. "I've been on more flights than you can count, and I've seen more than you'll ever understand. I've earned the right to sit where I want, wear what I want, and be treated with the respect I deserve." The attendant hesitated, taken aback by the quiet authority in Clint's voice. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in such a calm, unruffled way. She opened her mouth to respond, but Clint cut her off before she could say anything. "Before you say another word, let me tell you something," Clint continued. "Respect isn't something that comes with a uniform or a badge. It's earned in the way you treat others regardless of their appearance or status. So you can either apologize and treat me with the respect I deserve, or you can continue with your little power play. But remember, there's a lot more at stake here than a piece of clothing." The words hung in the air, and for the first time the attendant seemed unsure of herself. She had expected Clint to be embarrassed, maybe even humiliated, but instead, she was the one who felt uncomfortable. The passengers around them had started to take notice, and the atmosphere in first class had shifted. The flight attendant opened, her mouth again, but this time she wasn't sure what to say. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the realization that the flight attendant had misjudged Clint in a way she couldn't undo. Clint, still seated with his calm demeanor, didn't speak again, but his presence was enough to make her rethink her approach. She shifted on her feet, a sign that she was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Then, just as she was about to apologize, Clint stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't angry, but there was an unmistakable authority in the way he carried himself. The room seemed to hold its breath as he adjusted his jacket and looked directly at the flight attendant. "Listen, I get it," Clint said, his voice now calm but with a firmness that left no room for argument. "You're just doing your job. But sometimes it's important to remember that kindness is more powerful than your uniform, and respect is earned through humility, not by making someone feel small." The attendant's face flushed slightly, her eyes now filled with regret. She had acted without thinking, assuming that her position gave her the right to treat someone, anyone, with condescension. But Clint had stripped away her defense, leaving her with the uncomfortable truth that she had crossed a line. "I apologize," she said finally, her voice soft, a genuine acknowledgement of her mistake. "I didn't mean to offend you." Clint nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I understand. Just remember, every person you encounter has a story, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is treat them with dignity." The atmosphere in first class had shifted again, this time with a sense of quiet understanding. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange shared knowing glances, some even nodding in agreement with Clint's words. Clint returned to his seat, his eyes glancing around the cabin. It wasn't about the confrontation anymore. It was about the ripple effect of standing up for what's right. The attendant, still standing near the aisle, took a deep breath, her posture straightening as she silently vowed to carry Clint's words with her. She would never look at a passenger the same way again. The rest of the flight continued without incident. But the shift in the atmosphere lingered. The passengers who had witnessed the exchange between Clint and the flight attendant seemed more engaged, more present. Some were even looking at Clint with newfound respect, recognizing that he wasn't just another celebrity. He was a man who stood up for what was right. The flight attendant, though still visibly shaken, moved down the aisle, her demeanor more subdued. She made sure to pass by Clint's seat, giving him a quiet nod of respect. Clint, never one for drama or grand gestures, simply acknowledged her with a nod of his own, his expression calm, unbothered. It wasn't about being right or winning. It was about setting an example of how to treat people with dignity. The flight continued, but Clint's words stayed with the people around him. As the plane began its descent, the attendant returned to her duties, this time with a quieter, more humble approach. She was no longer trying to prove a point or assert her authority over others. Instead, she seemed to understand that true leadership was not in being the loudest or the most demanding, but in showing respect and kindness to those around you. Clint, as always, had made his impact, not with force or anger, but with a simple message, one that resonated deeply with everyone who had witnessed the exchange. As the plane landed, the flight attendants moved to the front to prepare for passengers to disembark. But this time, there was no tension, just a quiet, mutual respect in the air. As the passengers began to leave the plane, Clint remained seated, for a moment taking his time to gather his things. He had been through countless flights, countless confrontations, but there was something about this moment that made him pause. It wasn't just about the words he had spoken or the situation he had diffused. It was about the ripple effect that kindness and respect could have. He knew he wasn't always going to be there to step in when someone needed help. But maybe, just maybe, the flight attendant would think twice before treating someone unfairly again. As Clint stood up and made his way toward the exit, he noticed the flight attendant standing near the door, her head held a little higher, her posture more confident. She looked at him, and for the first time during the entire flight, their eyes met in a moment of mutual understanding. "Thank you," she said softly, almost to herself. But Clint heard her. He gave her a nod, acknowledging her apology, and then without a second thought he walked past her toward the terminal. The passengers who had witnessed the interaction stood in line, but many of them lingered, talking among themselves about what they had just seen. It wasn't just about Clint Eastwood. The story was about the reminder that everyone deserved respect no matter who they were. Clint had become more than just a figure in the public eye. He had become a symbol of integrity and kindness, a man who knew when to speak up and when to lead by example. As he stepped off the plane, Clint felt the weight of the moment settle into him. He wasn't seeking accolades, but he couldn't ignore the subtle change in the way people interacted with each other now. It was a small victory, but one that made a lasting impression on everyone who had been part of that flight. As Clint made his way through the airport terminal, he couldn't help but notice the quiet ripple his actions had caused. People glanced at him, not with awe, but with a quiet respect that went beyond the surface. It wasn't about his fame or his career. It was about the simple truth that he had shown kindness when it mattered most. The story of what had happened on the flight soon spread. People shared the details on social media, their messages filled with admiration for Clint's composed response to the flight attendant's behavior. It wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for what was right. The viral attention didn't surprise Clint. He was used to being in the public eye. But what struck him was the broader message that people were taking from the incident. Civility, respect, and kindness were the real takeaways. In the days that followed, the flight attendant reached out to Clint through a brief message, simply thanking him once again for the lesson he had imparted. "I won't forget this," she wrote. Clint, as always, kept his response short and to the point. "We all have our moments. It's how we move forward that counts." Clint had made his point, not with harsh words or confrontation, but with a quiet authority that left a lasting impression. As he walked through the terminal ready to continue his journey, he knew one thing for sure. The world could always use a little more kindness, and sometimes the smallest act of standing up for someone was the most impactful. He may have been just one man on a crowded flight, but in that moment Clint Eastwood had reminded everyone that respect wasn't earned by position. It was earned by how you treated others. Please subscribe channel for Clint Eastwood Respect. Thanks.